Welcome to a very special week with a very special guest, Dr. Earl Henslin. Before I introduce Dr. Henslin, I want to ask you this question. What if everything you thought you knew was wrong? And that's how I met our guest. Dr. Henslin is a psychologist, a licensed marriage and family therapist. He went to the Rosemead Graduate School of Psychology, which is part of Biola. He's the author of 10 books, the co-author of 3. He has led seminars and retreats for lay people and professionals nationally, internationally. He's been involved in coaching executives to become brain-healthy organizations. He and I have worked closely together for the last 25 years. He's one of Amen Clinic's best friends. He has his own group practice in Brea, here in Southern California, but he's so smart. And Tana and I wanted to have him on with you this week. And this week we're going to go over how imaging changes everything, how the brain and psychotherapy really go together very nicely. And we're going to share some inspirational stories along the way. So welcome, Dr. Henslin.
Yes.
It's a delight to be here with both of you, my 2 favorite people. And it's been so exciting the last 25 years. So
I know, it's hard to believe.
Yeah,
it's
kind of
wow.
like that.
So when I asked the question, what if everything you thought you knew was wrong? What did that bring up for you?
Well, it brought up to me that first seminar that I was at. At that time, there were so many patients coming in on ADD medication, and I'd read literally 5 or 6 books, and after a while, they all just sound the same. Nothing was new. But then your brochure came across the desk on ADD, but it was showing pictures of the brain, and that just excited me. So I knew there'd be something different here. So I'm so thankful today that one choice back then led to me meeting you. And when I was sitting in this room with probably about 250 to 300 other professionals, I was just stunned, as if you went through slide after slide after slide after slide, because several things hit me all at once. The first one was that if I was going to jump into this, I would have to be willing, ready to rethink every model of psychotherapy that I use, whether it was individual, marital, or family. That I would have to rethink that, because all the models of therapy that I've been trained in assume there's such a thing as a normal brain. And they didn't take into account brain chemistry, brain function, and so on. The second thing that hit me is that if I took this step, I was estimating I would probably lose about 1/3 of my practice income. Because at that time, I have a strong background in forensic testing and so on. And so when people would come in, I'd put, they would probably take anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 worth of tests to get a good report with a diagnosis and plan. I had psychiatrists, physicians just refer people to me just for that, even about medication recommendations at that time and so on. But I knew then that when people came in crisis, I couldn't look at them anymore and I'll say that was the best use of the money. Because when people are in crisis, they're motivated to do whatever it takes to change. And I knew I could get more information that was user-friendly with one picture than with the hours of testing and report write-up and so on. And so I sat there, I have a good practice, things are going well, things are going smoothly. If I do this, but then I realized, what if 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, this is the norm? And I missed out on an opportunity to help people in an entirely new and different way. And that's why I went up during a break and met you and encouraged you to start a clinic in Southern California.
Yeah, you are the reason that we expanded from our small clinic in Northern California. Our second clinic was here in Orange County.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, no, it's totally Earl. Because
So
all of
why
a
I
sudden,
met him.
so all of a sudden, 25% of our patients came from Southern California because of Dr. Henslin.
So we
And-
owe our relationship to Dr. Henslin?
We do.
Oh, wow.
Because I definitely would not have met you if I'd have stayed
would not
in
have.
Northern California.
Well, God works in wonderful and mysterious ways.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And then you started sending me patients, and then you came yourself. And then I started scanning people in your family. And one of my favorite stories is of Jessica. So right after we opened our Orange County clinic,
Right.
your niece came.
Right.
You want to tell that story?
Oh, sure. Jessica had a congenital ureter problem since birth. And what that meant was every year she'd go up to Johns Hopkins for all kinds of invasive procedures because they were waiting for her to get older before they did the surgery to correct that. So she's needle phobic. What I'm watching is a little girl growing up who's has all the signs of looking autistic. She'd have problems with anger, panic attacks, and it was affecting the whole family. And it took me 2 years, to convince my brother-in-law to get his little girl scanned. So when Jessica came here, my sister, was with her, and Mike, who's a wonderful guy, works here to this day, who's great at sticking. I mean, he draws blood. It makes it like it's not even happening. Well, she saw that needle and she started screaming and wouldn't let him come near. And then she said to this gentle soul, she said, "Do you have children?" And she's all of 5 years old,
Great.
And he goes, "Well, no." He says, "Well, man, what makes you think you can help me?" And so he walks out of the room shattered. And I, to this day, if I run into Mike, all I gotta do is say the word Jessica, and it's a PTSD reaction for him. So then they eventually called Uncle Earl to come down. So I raced down here wondering, what in the world am I gonna do to help motivate this little girl to get a scan? So my sister and I were in there talking to her, and my sister pulls out $100 bill
Oh, that's so
and says, "Will you do it for this?" And she goes, "No." And then Sandy goes, "Well, what will it take?" "A puppy."
Oh, she was
She's smart.
smart and working it.
Because her dad had said there'd never be a dog in
Right.
the family. And of course, my sister says, "You got it." And she sat there perfectly still when they injected the Ceratec and got the scan. And then it showed a ring of fire, and which is, it's like the whole brain is lit up, and like anything can trigger anger or panic and things like that. And you and I talked for about an hour and decided on Topamax. And so, because it hits the left and right basal ganglia and helps stabilize the temporal lobes, which has a lot to do with mood regulation. And literally, it was like 72 hours after the first dose of Topamax that my sister heard the words, "I love you."
Oh.
And then when she asked Jessica to pick up her toys or do something like that, she would do it rather than it being a big war. So I had so many experiences like that because, say if they brought in a Jessica to my office, well, we'd look at it as a family systems problem. It does affect the whole family, no doubt about it, but the intervention is different. Because then, if you balance out the brain chemistry, then you can actually make some changes with therapy. Now, and what happened was several years later, they were out here for my son's wedding, and I was bothered by the fact that she was like 2 years behind in school, and her anxiety, anger, all stayed managed, but yet she wasn't learning, and I knew she was an incredibly bright little girl.
Yeah, as evidenced by the puppy.
Exactly. And so we scanned her again. And what was so fascinating, and also at 5 years old, she was diagnosed with arthritis. So she was on an anti-inflammatory for that. But it showed there's still a lot of activity over the whole brain. But what it did show was that there's so much frontal cortex activity, hyperfrontality, that's why she wasn't learning, because she's all putting all her energy into managing the pain of the arthritis, and there's nothing left over to actually learn to get new information in or retrieve the information. And at that time, Dr. Renee Thomas, had been talking to us about omega-3 fatty acids. And she had a clinic in Boston then. And so my sister was in Virginia and took her up to, the whole family went up to see her. And Renee put her on a pharmaceutical grade liquid fish oil and took 1 month to work up to 1 tablespoon. And then my sister dropped the Vioxx 50% with no return of pain.
Wow.
Months 2 got her up to 2 tablespoons, which is like the equivalent of 14 to 16 grams per day. Took her completely off the Vioxx with no arthritis pain coming back. So that anti-inflammatory effect of the fish oil took care of that. Well, then month 3, dropped the Topamax 50%, no return of anxiety. Month 4, no return of anxiety, took her completely off. And so now it's just strictly nutrition with high levels of omegas.
Wow.
And then we re-scanned her. And by that time, you'd opened the clinic in Reston. And I've always been so grateful because that was like an hour drive from my sister now. And on that scan, you get a normal looking brain. The ring of fire is completely gone. It showed a little bit of a dropout in the front part of the brain, which showed the need for maybe a stimulant. But her learning skyrocketed.
Oh, wow.
I mean, she was at grade and level and beyond. And just last year, she called me up and she said, Uncle Earl, I want to thank you for never giving up on me. So
That's
gets
so
me.
sweet.
And she graduated on the honor roll from Virginia Commonwealth University with a degree in psychological economics, behavioral economics. And now she's looking at graduate schools.
Wow.
And she'll say, do you think I can do this work, Uncle Earl? And I said, well, Jessica, your grades are better than mine ever were.
Right.
So
Right.
she says, what better person to have someone like me who's lived it to do it? And I said, you got it, Jessica. You will be great. So now she's looking at graduate schools.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did you end up losing a third of your business?
No.
I was just curious.
No. It grew because then it was like at that time my oldest daughter was running the office, Rachel, and she told me, Dad, do you know you have a reputation for being the place to go when you've lost hope?
Oh, interesting.
And I said, really? She said, yeah. The lady called up. They'd been to 3 different therapists, 2 different treatment facilities, numerous physicians. And she asked if I thought it was going to be too big of a problem for you. And I just laughed and I said, no, for my dad, everything's just an interesting problem. He'll sort through it and you'll get better. It'll be okay. So,
that's what a great compliment.
Yeah, particularly from your daughter.
Aww.
So that's the reputation that's built. Now we've had families from Hong Kong, Korea, Europe, all across the United States, many families from Canada that will call and we work with them, and getting a history done. And now there's 8 Amen clinics to send people to. So I've referred people to every clinic in the country, which has been exciting.
When we come back, we're going to talk about how you use the information from the brain, from the scans, in doing psychotherapy with patients, because it's not just hardware, it's how you integrate
Right.
hardware and software together.
You bet.
Stay with us. Welcome back. Tana and I are here with our good friend, Dr. Earl Henslin, psychologist, author, trainer, coach, who has, outside of us at Amen Clinics, has ordered more scans and used them in clinical practice with literally thousands of patients. From little kids to old people, everybody in between. Before we get back to talking to Earl, I want to read one of the podcast reviews. And don't forget that if you leave a review at brainwarriorswaypodcast.com or on Apple, iTunes, will enter you in for drawing for a free cookbook from Tana. So this is from Kathleen. I absolutely love listening to you guys. Thank you. I became a brain warrior and lost 100 pounds
Wow.
and got off 9 medications. Went to Amen clinics after mold exposure and got the bachelor's and master's degree I was told were impossible
Wow.
for me. 2.8 GPA in high school in 1990, 5 failed attempts at college over a 20-year period. I'm about to start a degree program I never dreamed of, my doctorate. I'm 47 and it's never too late to change your brain, making me cry. I'm also doing our brain coach certification course through Amen Clinics. When my mental health miracle happened, it was basically because my chiropractor had read research done at Amen Clinics and taught me what he knew about diet and exercise and supplements like vitamins and fish oil, we just talked about that, to change your brain. Prior to Amen Clinics, I'd been wrongfully diagnosed with bipolar disorder,
Ooh.
obviously with anybody not looking at your brain. Was worth the trip to get that off my record and find out I really had 2 forms of ADD, mold toxicity, and an adjustment disorder, not bipolar. No wonder the bipolar meds didn't work and fish oil, chiropractic, etc. worked. Thank you a million times over for all you guys do.
That's awesome.
So I know you've heard stories like that a lot, and that's why you've referred so many patients to us. But what I want to talk about in this podcast is how you use the scans in psychotherapy.
Yeah, and what kind of therapy do you use? Do you find most effective and how does that sort of correlate to the information you get back with the scan? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, to me, it's always important to match the model to the person and what their needs are and so on. So I do anything from inner child work to deal with trauma to EMDR to thought field therapy, which is using acupressure points and dealing with different emotional issues, even to some psychoanalytic work. Because at that very first seminar with Dr. Amen, what struck me was that I knew if we could get a look at the brain, it was going to help change relapse rates for alcoholics, drug addicts, and sex addicts. And so far in these 25 years, only 100% of the time when I referred somebody for that type of scan, did it show up with some injury in the frontal cortex and the temporal lobes. You know. And so there's an area in the frontal cortex called the orbital frontal cortex that has to do with impulse control and conscience. And so when a person gets that craving for alcohol, drugs, or for sex, then they don't access that belief system. So where it fits with therapy, and just about every addict I've ever worked with, there's some history of trauma. They grew up in an alcoholic home, and there was physical, verbal abuse, or emotional abuse of some type. That, you know, in my field, the model is if you work enough on those issues, somehow you're magically not going to want to, you know, X, fill in the blank, turn to porn, alcohol, drugs, or whatever. But what I found out is the left and right basal ganglia, that anxiety part of the brain, if I could calm that down and help improve the blood flow in the front part of the brain, then when I did like an EMDR intervention or even an inner child kind of an experience, because you got to have good perfusion or blood flow all the way through here to actually connect with the feeling and then articulate it.
Interesting.
Because if that basal ganglia gets too high, then the perfusion drops
So the basal
out.
ganglia, for people who don't know, these large structures deep in the brain that are responsive to dopamine. And when it's too high, you feel anxious. And when it's too low, you have ADD symptoms and you can be unmotivated. And you're one of the few psychologists in the world that really believe I need to balance your brain because therapy will go better. It will go faster.
Right.
If your
Exactly.
brain works right. And without that, you're not going to be as effective. And so you will often tell your patients, I love this, that this is going to save you money
Right.
in the long run because we're going to be able to do therapy with a brain that works better
Exactly.
rather than trying to do software programming on a brain that has hardware problems.
Right. That's what I was going to say, is that we often refer to it as hardware and software. So the brain is the hardware, and the soul and what you're trying to accomplish with therapy
And
is
so
software.
Exactly.
when people have low frontal lobe function, so you and I have both seen thousands of people
Right.
like that. What are generally the things their partner says about them?
Oh, well, they get frustrated because they might start something, never finish it. They're going to have a hard time remembering. They might promise their spouse they're going to pick up, flowers or something, but they won't remember it, because they'll get distracted to someplace else. And then, particularly for the men I work with, they're just not emotionally available because now they're turning to video games, they're turning to staring at their phone, or any number of things just to wake up the brain and improve that dopamine with those kinds of activities, which takes them emotionally out of the family. So they're not there for their son, they're not there for their daughter. And then for kids, it's like they see dad going from one thing to another and feeling like he's so busy, he's got to do this, he's got to do that. And they're right there all the time waiting for the father to show an interest, stop and take the time and spend it with him, listen to him, and so on. Because a dad or a mom, really, they can't, unless that anxiety part of the brain is in balance and that front part of the brain is working, they're not going to be able to listen. They're not going to be able to empathize, with that child or connect with them at an emotional level. And they're not going to recognize the signs in them, that there might be some sadness or hurt or anger that they want to respond to. Because if they're in that ADD flurry of activity, or, then there's dad who's got some injury in the temporal lobes and can snap and just become explosive. In the first year of scans, there was 30 couples I had referred up to Fairfield, and every one of them, either the wife or the husband, had anger problems and addiction problems, and they'd been through rehab centers and treatment programs and so on. And as of probably last time I checked, about 15 years ago, 27 out of the 30 were still married.
Wow.
But couples and children are going from walking on pins and needles,
Right.
afraid if I say or do the wrong thing, that dad's just going to turn it into a major issue.
Well, and his low frontal lobes causes emotional trauma in
Right.
the wife and in the children.
Exactly.
And when we scan their brains, that has that diamond pattern. You were going to say something?
Yeah.
Oh. So balancing their brain is so important. Let's talk about when their cingulate works too hard.
Oh.
So cingulate is in the front part of the brain. It's often thought of as the brain's gear shifter. It lets you go from thought to thought, move from idea to idea. What have you seen working with couples when their front part of their brain isn't low, that it's really high in activity?
Yeah, the thing about the cingulate to me that's so fascinating is, like couples come in and they get into arguing and they throw in things that happened 25, 30 years ago. And so all those hurts and angers from back then are present, and they will do that in a circular, cyclical way. And so what I noticed is when we got the cingulate, the basal ganglia, left, right basal ganglia, calmed down and got more serotonin to the cingulate, then that resentment might come up, but then they'd say, internally would say, I forgave him for that, and then I have to leave that in the past. But prior to that, it was just boom, right there, and it was just as fresh as if they had done it, actually because when people rehearse those resentments, they literally reproduce the whole body
Yeah.
chemistry, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, and everything of that moment, and they have that same intensity going on. And then what can happen with the other person, then it's almost like a constant PTSD battle back and forth, where now one person's triggering the other, and they're both out of control.
Right.
When I see it, I often think about in their head, they have a little mouse on an exercise wheel,
Right.
and the mouse can't get off.
Nope.
And the mouse is mad, and it's huffing and puffing, and often they'll use marijuana, or they'll use alcohol, or they'll use pain medication to just get the mouse to shut up.
Exactly.
And that's not helpful. There are other things to do that are more helpful, because when they use those things, they'll drop their cingulate, but they'll also drop their frontal lobe, and then they'll make impulsive, stupid decisions that don't help. Our daughter, Chloe, when we scanned her front part of her brain was so busy, and you could just see how she gets stuck.
It changed so much about how I was able to communicate with her and parent.
yeah.
And I was like, oh, I've been giving her the wrong supplements. I've been trying to stimulate her.
Exactly.
But if you don't look at it, you know.
No, there's no way to know.
Yeah.
I had one man came in, his wife was ready to divorce him because he couldn't stay sober from his particular addiction. And then he was having late 40s, having memory problems. He had put stickies all over the place. Now, normally when you see, an anger problem, you start to look at his background, which was filled with traumas. And from a therapist standpoint, it's so easy to look at it just in terms of trauma and then start working on it. But, I had him scanned right away and did some memory testing. And here he was headed for dementia because of, staying in his addiction, not getting sober, and the multiple head traumas. And he was like in the 51st percentile, and was almost like looking at having to retire early. Well, we got the brain working, and then he was able to start to actually deal with the trauma and actually heal from it. And he started to stay sober. And one session he came in and he looked at me and he says, "Okay, doctor, what in the world is going on with me?" And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, I sat down with my daughters and watched a Disney movie with them." Now, see, before that, his intensity and anxiety was so much, he wouldn't even sit down and do that. I sat there and I watched that movie and I cried. What's going on with me?
Right.
I said, "Are things better with your wife?" And he just says, "Oh man, are they ever." But that's what I mean. Unless that whole...
and your mind follows.
Yeah.
Get your brain right. You actually had one of my favorite sayings I stole from you, which is no forethought equals no foreplay. It's right. If your frontal lobes don't work, or they work too hard, and you're not present, you can't imagine what's going on with your partner, then you're not going to get lucky.
Well, one of the things I stole from you, is that you don't need to say everything that comes to your mind.
Right.
Because in my field, it's like expression is everything, being able to articulate it. No one says, "Oh, don't say that. It's only going to have this effect." And so there are many therapists by not intending any harm, of course, but they don't stop people. Because I've learned, there's times I have to act like the frontal cortex for the patient when they don't have any.
Right.
And they're just being impulsive.
Like, what is the benefit of that going to be?
Exactly.
Are you going to get what you want?
Right.
Jerry Seinfeld once said the brain is a sneaky organ. We
Right.
all have weird, crazy, stupid, sexual, violent thoughts that nobody should ever hear. And your
Exactly.
frontal lobes, it plays it out. It's like, if I say that, is that a good thing or not a good thing? When we come back, we're going to talk about some stories of transformation that Dr. Henslin has been witness to. So what did you learn? Post that. What did you learn in this podcast or the one before? Post it on any of your social media channels and go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com. or on iTunes, leave a review and we'll automatically enter you into a drawing for a free book.
And be sure to share this if it was helpful to you at all. If you know someone suffering, if they're having family dynamic issues or they've had a head injury and you know they're having problems, share this with someone.
And also, Earl, how can they learn more about you? What books would you recommend? What's your website?
Well, the Brain on Joy book is the one that I really like the most. And anytime anybody reads that, they seem to be motivated to get scans. They know it puts it into understandable language. And my website's drhenslin.com.
So DRHENSLIN,
You got it.
drhenslin.com. Stay with us.
Welcome back. We are on day 3 with our friend and colleague, Dr. Earl Henslin, and we've been talking about the brain and psychotherapy and how you have utilized putting images into your practice. One thing we didn't mention about you, Dr. Henslin, is that you're actually on the board for the foundation for
Yes.
End Mental Illness Now.
Yeah, and because when I went to that very first seminar with Dr. Amen, on my drive home, I called a friend of mine who's, he and his wife are very successful business people. And I said, you got to go see Dr. Amen, explain the SPECT scan and everything. And the next week, they literally made an appointment and flew up to see you. And for him, it was the first time in his life that he was free from intense anger and from migraines. He'd been to all the best medical facilities around the country and no one had been able to help. And so then he called me up. It was like a month or two later. He says, he was talking with his wife and he said, we want to help people who can't afford to get these scans. Still gets me. And over the next 10 years, they basically contributed over $1 million.
Wow.
And we were able to help people get scans that would never be able to afford it.
Yeah.
There were pastors, missionaries, secretaries at a business or janitor. And then there were people that were doing well, but the money was so tight they just couldn't get the scan. And it was so wonderful to know that scan would help him. And I would say, let me make a call. And I have a friend who just might say yes. I can't promise anything. And so literally ever since then, that couple, they've only said yes, and have continued to help people today. When I walked in the building today, there was a patient in the waiting room, that they sent the money for to get a scan.
Oh, that's so funny.
And so to me, if anyone out there, because I know there's people listening that do have the means, and even if you can just make a small donation, whatever that would be.
Or if you just know someone that needs help, even.
To donate the money for them to get the scan, because it's life-changing. To give you a quick example, a person on disability, from working in a software company at a job she was not suited for in an abusive relationship, massively depressed. She came in with a medical file literally this thick. And she had massive panic attacks, couldn't get out of the house, and then plus incredible GI problems and so on. And so, and I was paid for this file, and she'd gone through every test, and MRIs, and labs, and everything. And I said, well, we need to get the scan. And she said, okay. So we got the donation and then sent her. And we got the brain balanced out for the very first time in her life. She went from being in an ER room on a quarterly basis for some reason, because her potassium and sodium had just suddenly dropped out. She couldn't eat. She was underweight. The anxiety was so intense. And so then as we got the brain balance out and the panic attacks down, then a flood of memories came back of being abused when she was a little girl. And only now we're able to work it through and have it be a healing experience. So within a 2.5-year period of time, she went out and started her own business and is making her way in the world today. Whereas before, she was being defined as permanently disabled for the rest of her life. Now there's no more workman's comp, and she's producing and happy, and her marriage made it through it, and they have a lovely marriage. Wow. And I literally could spend the entire day just telling story after story like that, because hopefully someone there will want to make that call or go online to make the donation to help another person, because she really is a gift of life. I mean, it's incredible.
I've had the same experience. I mean, I end up adopting people, sort of. I mean, I do this all the time. But there's only so many people
you
can
call me up and say, you're going to adopt this person.
Well, but you end up paying, we end up paying for it out of pocket, basically. And because there's so many people out there suffering. And so I'll be somewhere and I'll meet someone, I'll meet a veteran or someone who's just suffering horribly. And what are you going to, I feel terrible. Right. So I'll call them up and I'm like, I need to bring this person into the clinic. Right. I mean, we're going to have to do this, pay for it ourselves. But there's only so many people you can do that for. Right. So the foundation, that's the part of the foundation that really touches my heart, is when we can help people that really need help. And so those are the people, I mean, we're just trying really hard to build that part of our foundation to be able to help more people, because families change. Right. Like we adopted another person, we adopted literally, is my sister and my nieces. And we are completely literally changing the dynamics of that family, which will now change the next generation.
Exactly.
And that's the point.
Exactly.
So, I mean, we're trying as hard as we can to do our part. But if there are people who can help other people, some people can't. Right. But some people can.
Exactly.
So one of your stories that I really like the most is about your mom.
Oh.
Can you talk about that and what it was like for her when she got her first scan?
Yeah, my mom has had depression and problems with anger, and then more recently memory problems and migraines for over 50 years. And our farm in southern Minnesota is 15 miles away from the Mayo Clinic. And I have great uncles that actually worked with Charles and Will Mayo in the beginning. And so our family always had the best medical care, and yet no one looked at her brain. And so she never got the relief. She's on the typical meds for migraines and typically antidepressants, which now looking back actually made her worse. And so she was at probably the lowest point in her life, and severely depressed. And I had been trying for 10 years to get her to get a scan. And she kept saying no. And finally she said yes. And so she was after a Mother's Day weekend, and Monday morning we were we were in the lobby of the office, and I'm helping her fill out the forms. I said, Mom, have you ever had any head trauma? Because I can't remember an accident or you falling or slipping on the snow or the ice or anything. And she started crying. She said, well, I was 12 years old. I was swinging on a rope up in the barn, and the 2x4 holding it broke. And as she's falling, the board hit her in the back of the head. And her dad found her on the floor in a pool of blood. Oh. And that would have been 1944. And she had over 50 stitches to take care of the lacerations from that blow. So for me, what happened at that moment, just with her hitting her head there, I know there's going to be injury back here in the cerebellum and occipital lobes. It was going to bounce forward, be injury in the frontal cortex. And that's why growing up, she didn't think before she said or did things, And then the brain bounces around, and I knew there'd be injury in the temporal lobes, and that would be, and with that anxiety center high, then I knew finally the source of the migraines and depression that no antidepressant could help. Because one of the things I learned in that first seminar was that there are two systems of the brain that produce the same symptoms, but they require different strategies to help. And that's what gets confusing. Just a symptom of anxiety doesn't mean anything unless you look at the brain and know where it comes from. So we're sitting in Dr. Amen's office, and he brings her brain up, and my heart just sinks, because what I'm saying is not pretty. And so you said, you tell her. My mom said, I said, no, wait a minute. I'm like a patient here. This is my mom.
You
tell her. She knows both of us. And so she says, one of you boys say something. And so then I said, well, Mom, you're headed for dementia. Because the longitudinal fissure was right down the middle, looked like a Grand Canyon.
Oh, no.
And you could see the frontal lobes were atrophying and the temporal lobes. And my heart just sank. But I said, but Mom, you show no symptoms. So I looked at you and I said, so if we improve the perfusion or blood flow in the frontal cortex and the temporal lobes, you should be better. And I said, right, Dr. Amen? He nods and said yes. And so you put her on gabapentin medication. It hits that anxiety center, dials it down. And then supplements, brain and memory power boost, which was highly successful in the NFL football player study. And then I got her to start reading anything and everything that you write. So she keeps your stuff on her computer, and she knows nutrition backwards and forward. Plus, she began walking every day. Now, about 60 days later, I happened to get my dad on the phone. He was still alive then. And I said, Dad, what do you notice with Mom? And he said this. I gave her a birthday present, and she smiled, and she said, thank you. Because before that, like a spontaneous expression, this wasn't there. And then when I got a hold of Mom, I said, Mom, do you notice any changes between you and Dad? She says, I feel so sad for how hard I've been on him. I never had the ability to let things bounce off. That got me thinking about the role the brain plays in boundaries, because people can say hurtful things or do hurtful things. It's not good to overreact, not good to underreact. But calming down that basal ganglia, getting that frontal lobes working, actually gave her the ability to let something bounce off that would have made her angry before. Then what happened, all of a sudden, that's 13 years ago, and I was 54, I hate to admit. And I started to get used to having a mom.
Right.
Because then when I'd call, she'd say, how are you doing? And she just really wanted to know. And wanted to know what you could pray for and things like that. And then in the last 10 years of my dad's life, I watched them be affectionate to each other. So I saw love and I saw caring there that I hadn't seen growing up. And so, but the impact on that was across 4 generations. My granddaughter had me come and talk to her school about the brain. They got to the drug and alcohol part of their house book, and she said, let's ask my grandpa to come. He's famous, and he knows a lot about the brain. He'll show pictures. So I go and I show these kids pictures of 6th graders, and the stuff that came out of the woodwork was just amazing. Yeah. But I started to tell a story about the importance of exercise. And because my dad, when he was given 6 months to live, he went out and got a job as a security guard. I was trying to figure out why. It took me 2 months. And I said, Dad, did you do that because those doctors told you to walk and the only way you're going to walk is if you get paid for it?
Oh, it's so funny.
And he said, yes. Well, Georgia raises her hand, my granddaughter, as I start to talk about exercise. And she says, I said, do you have a question? She says, no, I want to talk about great-grandpa. Great-grandpa took care of his brain, took care of his heart, and he lived 22 years beyond when he was told he had 6 months to live. And he got a job that helped him to keep walking because his brain needed that and his heart needed that. And my great-grandpa, when he called me, he would ask me how I was doing, and he'd ask me how I was doing with the things I asked him to pray for. And he would remember that from one call to the next. Well, I'm standing there in tears because I'm no different than anybody. You're doing all you can do just to get through the day. You never dream, because I never sat down with my granddaughter and told her the whole story or anything, but that's what she had constructed out of that. And so when we make this change, we're not making a change just for here. this is four
Future
generations. Yeah.
There's so many
Yeah.
pieces
It's
to
amazing.
that story.
That's beautiful.
So what's it like when you grow up with a mom who's had a head injury, who's depressed, who doesn't have a good filter, who, when she does filter things, it's filtered through depression or negativity, and then the transformation? It's just so special for me to be, a small part of that story. When we come back, we're going to actually begin to wrap this up on how does the brain and the mind work together. And if there's something you learn from this podcast, write it. Send it to us, post it on any of your social media channels, and hashtag Brain Warriors Way. Go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com or Apple Podcasts. Leave a review. We'll enter you into a free drawing for one of Tana's books. You can also leave us questions at brainwarriorswaypodcast.com. Every week we don't have a guest, we'll answer questions.
And please share it. So if you know someone who can use the information, don't forget to share it.
And also, you can learn more about Dr. Henslin. One of his best books is Brain on Joy, or you can go to his website at Dr. Henslin, Henslin, drhenslin.com. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our last day with Dr. Henslin. It's been wonderful this week having with you and Dr. Henslin talking about, the brain and how you use the brain and incorporate it into psychotherapy. And he's our friend and he's our colleague, and you're involved in our foundation. And it's been so wonderful hearing your stories. So today we want to talk about the brain. And what did you wanted to incorporate that into?
The mind.
Yeah.
Because people think of them as separate. When you do the work that you and I have done for so long, you realize they're not separate.
Right.
And that if your brain's not right, your mind's not right.
Exactly.
And, you have a doctorate degree in psychology. You're also a marriage and family therapist. How much of your training to optimize and heal the mind, how much did you get about the brain?
Absolutely zero.
Really?
Yeah, there was one course on neuroanatomy.
How is that possible?
Neuroanatomy, which I did take, but the book was lousy and the professor was boring.
Well,
I fell asleep to
seriously?
it. Now I read that stuff for leisure, but no emphasis. There's like one class on psychopharmacology, but then that's taught in a traditional way, and to me it's useless.
Yeah,
for
no,
all
this is no
psychologists.
surprise. When I do lectures,
That's a
probably you
surprise to
too,
me.
and I
Yeah.
go, how many of you therapists, psychologists, had courses on brain function, brain health? Nobody raises their
I'm
hand.
shocked.
It's insane that the organ they're working on is not the mind. It's the brain and the mind together.
What's scary for me, and I saw this in the first seminar, was that I began to realize if I didn't change the assessments that I was doing, that really it was malpractice, because the traditional testing and assessments, there is a place for them, but they yield psychological or something we call psychodynamic kind of information, but they don't yield brain chemistry things and what to do to help each system of the brain. And to me, I always think it's kind of humorous when people try to separate, like you're saying, the brain from the mind. I mean, they're...
Yeah, that seems odd to me. I can't.
That your mother's mind was in pain because of her brain.
Right.
And when you helped her to balance her brain, she became the person she always wanted to be.
Exactly.
And that's why I hate the term personality disorders.
Exactly.
Because it's like, well, what's the organ of personality? It's your brain.
Exactly.
And,
it
we
feels
have
so
shamed,
esoteric and like
right.
out there otherwise.
We have shamed people. We've blamed people. And I'm embarrassed by it for my profession. We need to do better. And what I love about you, I mean, many things, but it's you actually take this and put it into a busy psychological practice where you help people every day. And then you taught all the other doctors in your practice to do the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. To give you a specific example of what we're talking about with that, between the brain and the mind, it'd be like you have wonderful material in all your books on automatic negative thoughts. And those are those thoughts that pop out of nowhere, just say I'm bad or I'm worthless or I'm a failure or whatever. No, cognitive behavioral therapy is designed to work with those thoughts. The problem with looking at it strictly from cognitive behavioral theory and therapy is that when the basal ganglia, left and right basal ganglia, is lit up, and when that cingulate is way overactive, they can't make that shift from the negative thought to a positive cognition.
And the ants beat them up.
Exactly.
I am so confused by this because as a neurosurgical ICU nurse, right? So we deal with the brain.
Right.
People's behavior changes radically right in front of you.
Right.
So I'm having maybe because it's so radical, they're not counting that? I don't understand. But how do you not think that the brain and your behavior are connected? I'm completely confused by that. I didn't realize you guys...
But you can try and kill yourself in every major city in the world, and virtually no one will look at your brain on a routine basis.
But I mean, someone comes in, they have brain surgery. The next thing I know, they're singing La Cucaracha for 3 days straight and they won't stop.
Right.
Or they become incredibly violent, or they're seeing things crawling on the wall because they've hurt certain parts of their brain, or they scream nonstop. How can you not think the brain is connected to your behavior and what you see and how you feel and how you think?
And one of the big lessons, I'd be interested in your take on this. One of the big lessons I've learned, and I didn't know it, and I'm an Army trained psychiatrist, which means we thought about head trauma.
Right.
Because there was a lot of it in Vietnam. And 40% of the patients who come to Amen clinics for mental health reasons had a significant brain injury in their past, 40%. And that mild traumatic brain injury is a major cause of psychiatric problems. So just like with your mom, that injury can set off a cascade of negative effects that doesn't just affect her, but it also affects her husband. It affects her babies. It affects the psychology of her babies, which then impact how they parent. Right. And you can see how that board breaking and those 50 stitches and the shaking of her brain, it's not just about her. No. It's about generations of her. Exactly. And don't you have the same...
And healing. You talked about before we got on here, you talked about the healing that occurs in different families. And that's just amazing. That's what we love to see, is the healing,
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah,
generational healing.
Yeah, no, there's children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren are experiencing a grandmother that's fully present, and they don't see her as an angry person or anything like that. I mean, it's beautiful. There's no pins and needles.
When that happens, do you notice with some of your patients that when the patient starts to heal, they suddenly feel sad and guilty?
Oh,
And they have a lot to deal with from all the years.
They do. Yeah,
and that's a
common.
psychotherapy
Right.
issue.
So now, but now they're
Forgiveness.
able to do it.
Right.
Is so important.
Yeah, no, because there's a, you're right on the money. There's like this grief reaction.
That happened.
Because it all clicks. Oh my, what have I done? You know, and what have I missed out on, and so on.
That happened with my sister. There
And-
was suddenly a lot of sadness.
Exactly.
And that's important to talk through.
It is.
And so we are not opposed to psychotherapy. We love psychotherapy.
course.
We think psychotherapy is so important, but you want to do it with hardware that works.
Right, it
You
needs to
want
be
to do it with a
effective.
brain that works correctly. It's just so powerful. One more story before we have to stop. Is there one on the top of your head?
Yeah, one that kind of illustrates everything we talked about. You know, pastor and his family referred their son-in-law to me, veteran from Afghanistan, and was disabled 100% because the Humvee ahead of him, and they're all friends, got hit with an IED, and he watched the vehicle explode and everybody burned to death. And then his huge firefight where he did manage to save the lives of 3 or 4 people in his group, you know, but the PTSD, and he'd been through extensive treatment at the VA, and the family had paid for a lot of treatment out of their pocket. And then they called me because he was getting worse and becoming suicidal himself. So I called my friends because they didn't have the money for this, and they donated the money to get him a scan. And he lives on the East Coast. So came in on a Friday morning, got the scan, got read. I mean, they sent me the pictures because by the end of the day, they were back in my office. And so I have this 2-3 hour block to go over the scan and decide on what to do now. And he'd already in his history been reactive to just about every medication. You could just tell it was mood stabilizers or anti-anxiety, antidepressants. He overreacted to everything. And so I suggested he use a combination of Neuralink and GABA calming support 3 to 4 times a day. Because when I was looking at a scan, I could see if we could just lower that basal ganglia a little bit, then maybe he wouldn't hyper-focus, you know, turn those thoughts over and over. And his wife is an RN, and she's sitting right there in a session, and then I take him through, have him take the supplement right then and there, and then took him to a thought field therapy exercise, and he had, you rate these things on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being horrible, 0 being neutral. And just thinking about the picture, you know, of that, he rated, you know, 5,000. I mean, it was just that bad. And so I took him through the sequence of tapping. I was using like acupressure points. Pain came out, the fear came out, but with that anxiety center just a little bit lower, that front part of the brain could click in and he could actually process it and talk about it. And so we spent a couple hours going through that. And then I taught the wife, I said, because they were headed up to the mountains, somebody was loaning him a house. I mean, it was just God's timing because it was going to be quiet and things like this. And I taught her how to do this thought field therapy, because if this happened, because it wouldn't be unusual for more to come back, to do that up at the house in the mountains. And I got the loveliest voicemail the next day where they called to let me know that he got up there, and oh yeah, it was also restless sleep. The supplement that is produced here is excellent. So I had him take that at night too. And he slept all the way through the night, didn't wake up one time. It was the first time since he'd been back from the Middle East that he'd been able to sleep. And so he had everything kind of collided together where you got to look at the brain, we're able to do something to help the brain to calm down so it could process this horrible trauma he'd been through. And then he was able to actually go to bed and sleep all the night through. A year later, I get a email from him, and that he'd gone back to college, and because he was close to finishing college, but he had to drop out because of all the trauma, and graduated with his bachelor's degree, and now was going to be working as an elementary school teacher. And this guy is going to be one of those men that's going to be that father figure to so many kids. It's going to be healing, and because he's such a gentle spirit, and he's still taking the supplements to this day.
So healing is possible.
It kind of reminds me of the story of Denny. So one of the people I rescued, was like I adopted, was a veteran.
The foundation paid for.
The foundation paid for, right?
So.
He same thing. His vehicle hit an IED in Afghanistan, and he watched his 3 friends die in front of him, and he was hurt really badly. And he, over the next few months, went through that sort of rabbit hole to hell that they go through when they get back, and woke up one day with a gun in his mouth. And it's just terrible. But now he's so much better. He's learned so many skills. He's been able to learn those skills because his brain's better, and he has full custody of his daughter. And he's just doing amazing.
Beautiful.
He's married.
That's exciting.
Oh, it's incredible.
Well, we have to thank you so much for
thank you,
Yeah.
guys.
being on the podcast with us. You are one of our favorite brain warriors, Dr. Earl Henslin, drearlhenslin.com, his book, one of his books, Brain on Joy. What'd you learn today? Post that. The thing I learned is the brain and mind are totally connected, and they can be better, but you have to work in concert. So post what you learned on any of your social media channels and hashtag Brain Warriors Way. Also go to Brain Warriors Way podcast.com or Apple Podcasts, leave a review, and we will enter you into drawing for Tana's cookbook, The Brain Warriors Way. Also leave questions, and we'll answer them on weeks that we don't have a guest. I hope you've enjoyed Dr. Henslin as much as we've loved him over the years. Excited to have you back next week.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.